Ma'am, I'm just asking you to step back from the door for a moment, all right?
I'm not stepping anywhere. This is my vehicle and I'm not under arrest.
I'm not saying you are. I just need to make sure everything stays safe.
Then let's keep it safe by keeping this professional.
I'm right.
That afternoon, the vast parking lot in front of Riverwalk Mall was bathed in the intense summer sun. The asphalt radiated a stifling heat, reflecting dazzling light onto the rows of luxury cars parked neatly as if prearranged. The air carried a faint, acrid smell of hot asphalt, mingled with the subtle aroma of coffee from a mobile vending cart near the entrance, and blended with the sounds of cars coming and going and the scattered conversations of shoppers. Amidst this seemingly unremarkable scene, a woman of color stood beside her black sedan, impeccably dressed in a light-colored blazer over a silk blouse, her demeanor neat and composed. She opened the trunk, carefully placing each shopping bag inside, each movement slow and natural. Like everyone else enjoying a normal shopping trip, there was no rush, no anxiety, just a quiet, ordinary moment passing by amidst the crowd. But in that very ordinariness, a cold, decisive voice suddenly rang out from behind, shattering the stifling atmosphere. "Ma'am, get out of the car immediately." The woman froze, then slowly turned. Before her stood a young police officer, his gleaming insignia pinned to his chest, one hand near his holster. His eyes narrowed in vigilance. There was no greeting, no explanation, only suspicion evident in every gesture. She looked directly at him, her calm but firm voice echoing through the crowded parking lot. "What is it, officer?" And that brief question marked the moment when an otherwise perfectly normal afternoon began to shift in a different direction, where every everyday action was scrutinized, and a small misunderstanding was silently opening the door to a series of unexpected events. The young officer didn't answer immediately. He stood still for a moment, his eyes scanning the woman from head to toe as if searching for some detail to bolster his suspicions. Then he cleared his throat, his voice dry and familiar, the tone of commands memorized during training. He said that the center had just received a call reporting a suspicious person around this parking lot, and as requested, she needed to present her identification for verification. There was no specific description, no behavior mentioned, just a vague ambiguity disguised as a procedure. The woman tilted her head slightly, her eyes calm, but reflecting the alertness of someone who understood the situation. She looked around the parking lot, where dozens of other people were unloading their belongings, opening trunks, and getting into expensive cars no less luxurious than her own sedan. "I'm loading my things into my car and getting ready to leave," she said slowly. "Can you tell me what suspicious behavior I exhibited?" The question rang out clearly, neither challenging nor defiant, simply a reasonable request. But it made the officer pause. For a brief moment, uncertainty flickered across his face, then quickly masked. Instead of answering, he repeated the request in a firmer tone, ordering her to remain still and present her identification. At the same time, from a distance, a soft screech of tires echoed, and a second patrol car silently pulled into the parking lot, its flashing lights but no siren. Its appearance was an invisible signal that instantly altered the atmosphere. Several shoppers slowed their pace, their eyes turning toward them. Some paused briefly. Others pulled out their phones, observing curiously from afar. The vague suspicion now gained weight, and in that sunny parking lot, a seemingly minor situation began to quietly escalate, gradually moving away from its initial normalcy. The woman took a slow breath, then deliberately kept her hands in a conspicuous position, each gesture deliberate. She opened her small leather purse, her movements slow and deliberate, as if to ensure everyone watching could clearly see. Inside were her driver's license, a few personal documents, and a thicker than usual, finely plated card bearing the official emblem of the South Carolina Supreme Court. She didn't immediately hand it over, but looked directly at the officer, her gaze calm yet sharp, devoid of any fear. Her voice was steady and clear in the gradually falling silence of the parking lot. She stated that everything she was doing was perfectly legal, that she was willing to cooperate, but only under formal objection. She said she had the right to know the legal basis of her detention, and that she also had the right to acknowledge that this contact was not based on any wrongdoing. The words weren't loud or harsh, but each one was precise, as if carefully considered. The officer glanced quickly at the papers in her hand, his gaze lingering longer on the card with the unfamiliar seal, a fleeting hesitation crossing his young face. In that brief moment, reason seemed to knock, giving him a chance to retreat, a chance to question his initial assumption. But then he clenched his jaw, straightening his back, as if reminding himself that backing down now would mean admitting his mistake to the watching crowd. He returned the papers, his voice higher and firmer than before, announcing that he would call for verification and instructing her to remain seated until the check was complete. At the same time, his hand reached for the radio, his voice brief and cold, requesting backup. Sunlight shone down on the car's gleaming hood, reflecting dazzling rays, while whispers began to rise around them. The tension was no longer confined to the two of them, but had spread throughout the entire parking lot, where a silent confrontation between composure and a power ego was gradually forming. The arrival of the second patrol car was like an invisible line, dividing the parking lot in two, one side where normal activity continued, the other the focal point of increasingly intense attention. Footsteps slowed. Interrupted conversations fell silent. Several shoppers paused beside their cars, their eyes filled with a mixture of curiosity and unease. Phones were pulled out, screens lit up. Lenses pointed at the woman and the officers standing opposite each other in the sunlight. No one spoke, but everyone sensed that this was no longer a routine inspection. The woman remained standing, shoulders straight, hands lightly placed over her stomach, every movement deliberate, as if she were placing herself within an absolutely safe space. She didn't argue, didn't back down, only observed how the situation was being pushed further and further away from normalcy. The young officer paced back and forth briefly, his eyes darting quickly towards the people filming before returning to the woman. His voice no longer firm, but laced with tension. He reiterated her request to wait while the information was verified, and asked her to keep her distance from the vehicle. His words sounded more like an order than a Finn's instruction. In that instant, another patrol car pulled up, stopping not far away, its lights reflecting off the windshield and the asphalt. 3 police cars surrounded a woman who was simply unloading her shopping. The whispers around them became clearer, no longer concealed. Some shook their heads slightly. Others uttered incomprehensible exclamations. The atmosphere became thick and heavy, as if the parking lot were holding its breath. The woman looked up at the officer, her voice still calm but clearer than ever, reiterating that she was cooperating and requesting that everything be fully documented. Her gaze was now fixed not only on him, but also on the recording phones, a silent reminder that every action, every subsequent decision, was being witnessed. Meanwhile, the officer felt the pressure tightening, but instead of easing, he straightened up, trying to maintain control. The initial misunderstanding, small and vague, had now ballooned into a tense public situation where ego and prejudice began to override reason. pushing things closer to a point of no return. The tense atmosphere lasted only a few seconds, but it felt like a heavy, oppressive weight. Then the young officer stopped, turned directly towards the woman, his voice sharper than before, leaving no room for dialogue. He ordered her to turn her back and place her hands behind her back for security during verification. The words fell on the parking lot like a cold, sharp cut. Several people nearby gasped, some involuntarily letting out a soft gasp in disbelief. The woman looked at the officer for a moment, her eyes neither angry nor panicked, but with a clear awareness that a legal boundary had just been crossed. She nodded slightly, slowly turning around, each movement deliberate and controlled, as if to ensure no one could say she was resisting or posing a danger. As the cold metal handcuffs closed around her wrists, a dry click echoed clearly in the unusually quiet space, startling many. For a moment, the parking lot seemed to freeze. Phones were raised higher, lenses pointed directly, capturing every detail. A man standing nearby shook his head, muttering that this couldn't be true. Another woman covered her mouth, her eyes filled with bewilderment. The handcuffed woman remained upright, head held high, her face remarkably calm. She said nothing, but her silence resonated more powerfully than any protest. The officer directed her toward the patrol car, his hand behind her back. Not roughly, but firmly, as if trying to demonstrate that everything was still under his control. But at that very moment, when a woman unloading her shopping was handcuffed in broad daylight, in front of dozens of witnesses, the situation officially crossed a point of no return. This was no longer a document check, no longer a vague verification, but had become a public detention, without clear justification. The sun still shone on the parking lot. Life around her went on. But within the small circle where the woman stood, a grave mistake had just been locked away by cold metal, initiating consequences that none of those present could have foreseen. The woman who was just handcuffed is not an unknown name. She is Justice Angela Reed, 54 years old, one of the most powerful and respected judges of the South Carolina Supreme Court. For decades, she has sat on the state's highest tribunal, delivering rulings that directly impact the law, civil rights, and especially how law enforcement must adhere to the Constitution. Born and raised in a humble working-class neighborhood in Columbia, Justice Reed witnessed early on the injustices that permeated the lives of marginalized communities. These experiences spurred her to pursue a career in law, not for fame, but to create clear limits on power and protect the most vulnerable. She studied at Howard University, where she worked part-time to cover her expenses, spending long nights studying law and volunteering on weekends at free legal aid centers. After graduating, she quickly made a name for herself handling difficult civil rights cases, readily confronting powerful agencies and individuals. Upon her appointment to the state Supreme Court, she became known for her meticulousness, toughness, and uncompromising stance against abuses of power, particularly in cases involving the unlawful stopping, searching, and detention of citizens. Ironically, the very woman who had dedicated her life to interpreting and defending the Fourth Amendment, reminding police of the boundaries of state power, now stood in a parking lot, handcuffed, treated like an unnamed suspect. Meanwhile, the young officer escorting her to the patrol car was completely unaware that he had just placed handcuffs on the wrists of a woman who had signed rulings that could end the careers of officers who violated the Constitution. For Justice Reed, this moment wasn't a shock, but a chilling realization. She understood perfectly what had just happened. Every legal boundary that had been crossed, and that any action from this moment onward would have far more far-reaching consequences than an interrupted shopping trip. In the glaring sunlight of the parking lot, the truth about her identity remained unspoken, but its weight had silently loomed over the entire situation, waiting for the moment to be revealed and turn everything upside down. The officer leading Justice Reed toward the patrol car was Kevin Marshall, 28, who had spent 6 years in the Charleston police force. He joined the force right after leaving academy, driven by a desire to prove himself and a belief that toughness was the measure of a good officer. In his early years, Marshall was considered a process follower, unafraid to intervene. But he also soon revealed a worrying tendency. He often took minor situations too far. Marshall's record included numerous complaints from citizens about excessive stops and checks, particularly targeting people of color, but all ended with internal warnings. With no formal disciplinary action taken, this reinforced his feeling that his methods, however controversial, remained within the safe zone of the system. Marshall believed in his professional intuition, in acting quickly to control the situation. And above all, he feared being perceived as hesitant or weak in front of his colleagues. For him, backing down, apologizing, or admitting a mistake was not just a personal error, but a blow to his reputation. That day, upon receiving a vague description of a suspicious person in the parking lot, preconceived notions quietly surfaced. A black woman standing next to a luxury car, impeccably dressed, but out of place in his familiar setting, quickly became the object of suspicion. Throughout the encounter, Marshall had several opportunities to stop, ask questions, or simply accept that he might have misunderstood. But each glance from the crowd, each phone raised to record, only made him feel more challenged. Instead of de-escalating, he reacted by tightening his grip on power, calling in reinforcements, and ultimately ordering handcuffs. For Marshall, it was the only way to maintain control and protect his image in that brief moment. He failed to realize that these decisions, based on fear and assumptions, were leading him down a grave error, where everything from process and professional ethics to the Constitution was cast aside, paving the way for consequences he could not fully comprehend. The patrol car rolled out of the parking lot, leaving behind the still shocked stares of the crowd and phones still recording until the very last minute. Inside, the cramped space reeked of plastic, sweat, and stale coffee. Justice Reed sat upright in the back seat, her handcuffed hands neatly placed in front of her stomach, her gaze fixed on the window, where traffic continued to move as if nothing unusual had happened. She didn't say a word, but in her mind, every detail of the encounter was meticulously pieced together: the timing of the stop, the initial command, the absence of legal grounds, the decision to call for reinforcements, and the moment of the handcuffs. For her, this wasn't just a personal experience, but a sequence of events that needed to be recorded precisely. When the car stopped in front of the Charleston police station, the rear door opened with a dry, metallic click. Justice Reed was led inside, through fluorescently lit corridors where the smell of cleaning supplies and the echoing footsteps created a cold, distant atmosphere. In the reception room, she was asked to sit down. Still handcuffed, the space was a stark contrast to the sun-drenched parking lot earlier, a heavy silence hanging over her. Justice Reed gently placed her purse and papers on the counter, then slowly pushed her Supreme Court stamped card toward the officer on duty. Lieutenant Sandra Whitaker, a woman with over 20 years in the service, stepped forward after a brief briefing. She took the card, her eyes scanning the familiar details: And in an instant, the sternness on her face turned into intense concentration. Without doubt or hesitation, Whitaker turned to the phone, dialing the court office directly. The room fell silent, broken only by the long ringing of the phone and the curious glances of the other officers watching. When the person on the other end confirmed their identity, the atmosphere in the room changed instantly. No longer a suspect to be investigated. The woman sitting there was a sitting Supreme Court justice. Whitaker slowly lowered the phone, taking a deep breath as if to maintain her professional composure. She turned to look at Justice Reed, her voice low and clear, confirming that her identity had been confirmed. In a corner of the room, Kevin Marshall stood silently, his face pale as he gradually understood the meaning of what had just happened. The certainty he had tried to maintain since the beginning of the hour vanished, giving way to a heavy feeling rising in his chest. In the cold fluorescent light of the police station, that moment of truth had completely reversed the situation, turning a vague verification into an undeniable and grave mistake. No one spoke for the next few seconds, but the silence was palpable. Lieutenant Whitaker placed her Supreme Court badge on the table, her gaze sweeping across the officers present, then settling on Kevin Marshall. Her voice wasn't loud, but it was clear enough for everyone to hear as she asked whether the entire process of stopping, calling for backup, and handcuffing had been recorded by body cameras and patrol car cameras. The question wasn't accusatory, but it carried a clear message from this moment on. Everything would be judged by process and law. There was no room for vague justification. Justice Reed remained seated, her hands still cuffed, but her upright posture and calm gaze made the room seem to revolve around her presence. She spoke slowly and clearly, demanding the immediate removal of the handcuffs and requesting that all relevant documentation be preserved, including the initial report from the center, radio communications, recordings, officers' personal cameras, and any video footage from supporting forces' vehicles or equipment. There was no anger in her tone, only the precision of someone who understood the authority and responsibilities of each party. Whitaker nodded, motioning for another officer to approach. The sound of metal echoed again as the handcuffs were removed, this time not to grant freedom, but to return them. Justice Reed gently rubbed her wrists, where faint red marks remained, then rose, her demeanor unwavering. She reiterated, in a calm but firm voice, that the detention was legally unfounded and would be fully reviewed. Kevin Marshall stood aside, his gaze averted, his hands clenching and unclenching repeatedly, as if trying to process the overwhelming feeling of unease. In the duty room, the atmosphere had completely changed. The other officers no longer viewed Justice Reed as a subject of scrutiny, but as a figure of far greater authority. Power had shifted, not through threats or intimidation, but through the presence of truth and the law. What had just happened in the parking lot now appeared clearer than ever as a series of consecutive mistakes. And everyone present understood that this story would not end in this small room under the fluorescent lights. News of the incident spread faster than anyone at the police station could have predicted. Within hours, videos taken by citizens in the parking lot had surfaced on social media, attracting thousands of views and comments. The image of a black woman handcuffed in broad daylight for a simple parking situation quickly sparked outrage. When her identity was confirmed as a Supreme Court judge, the outrage intensified, not because of her position, but because of the question it posed to the public. If someone in that position is treated this way, what about ordinary citizens? Local and national media outlets joined the fray. Legal experts were called in to analyze every detail of the incident, from the initial arrest to the decision to call in reinforcements and use handcuffs. They pointed out that there was no reasonable basis for detaining Justice Reed, let alone imprisoning her. The escalation of the situation was seen as a serious violation of the Fourth Amendment, which protects citizens from unlawful searches and arrests. Meanwhile, civil rights organizations spoke out, citing the incident as a prime example of how subconscious bias can lead to abuse of power in law enforcement. Inside the Charleston Police Department, pressure mounted by the hour, the leadership was forced to announce a formal internal investigation, ordering the sealing of all relevant data and suspending Officer Kevin Marshall pending review. Reports were reviewed, and video footage was replayed in closed meeting rooms. The atmosphere in the department became tense, not just because of an individual mistake, but because of the realization that this incident could have far greater consequences, affecting the reputation of the entire force. Outside, the public closely followed every development, demanding transparency and clear accountability, while the story that began in a scorching parking lot transformed into the focal point of a broader dialogue about citizenship, justice, and the limits of power. While the internal investigation was still underway, Justice Reed didn't wait to act. That same day, she began working with her legal team, systematically reconstructing the entire sequence of events in chronological order. From the initial vague phone call to the moment she was handcuffed in a crowded parking lot, every detail was meticulously documented, cross-referenced with audio and video recordings from police cameras and clips filmed by bystanders. With years of experience on the courtroom, she understood that the truth needed to be stated, but proven with clear and irrefutable evidence. A formal complaint was quickly filed, leading to a civil lawsuit against the city and the police department. However, the focus of the lawsuit wasn't just on compensation for the abuse and unlawful detention she had suffered, but also on demanding systemic change. Justice Reed's legal team emphasized the need for retraining on constitutional rights, identifying and controlling subconscious biases, and establishing independent oversight mechanisms to prevent unnecessary escalation in the future. These demands were made public, making it impossible to resolve the matter quietly or through private compromise. Under pressure from public opinion and growing legal risks, the city of Charleston entered into tense negotiations. Meetings lasting for hours revolved around accountability, a reform, and restoring community trust. Meanwhile, Kevin Marshall remained suspended, awaiting the final decision from the disciplinary board. For Justice Reed, this wasn't a personal battle, but a moral obligation. She repeatedly stressed that simply an apology or compensation would be meaningless. Her goal was to turn a deeply unjust experience into a precedent, forcing the system to reflect and change, so that what happened to her wouldn't be repeated with those who lack the same standing or powerful voice. Under increasing public pressure and the inevitable legal process, the case concluded with a landmark settlement. The city of Charleston accepted responsibility, not only with substantial compensation, but with a commitment to concrete reforms within the police force. Policies on stopping and using coercive measures were reviewed from scratch. Training on constitutional rights and identifying subconscious biases became mandatory, and an independent oversight mechanism was established to monitor citizen complaints. This wasn't a personal victory, but an acknowledgement that the system was flawed and needed correction. Justice Reed left this story with her honor unshaken. But more than that, she left a significant mark. She didn't appear in public seeking sympathy, but to emphasize a clear message: the law is only meaningful when it is applied fairly to everyone, regardless of status, race, or circumstances. The incident in the parking lot that day became a lesson discussed in training classes and in discussions about police reform. A vivid example of the consequences of allowing prejudice to override reason. The story ends. But its echoes remain. It reminds us that the freedoms enshrined in the Constitution are not self-evident, but must be continuously protected, day by day, with vigilance and responsibility. An ordinary afternoon became a test for justice. And from that test, a change was initiated. Justice, when properly examined, not only corrects mistakes, but also paves the way for a better, fairer system for all.